and this tutorial will guide you step by step on how to sew a lined bodice featuring a shirred back panel. When planning to finish a garment with lining, it's important to identify which seams will be neatly finished with the lining and which will be left open to turn your garment right side out. For this garment, we will be leaving the armholes and waist seams open, while the back shirring will be neatly encased in the lining. This tutorial can be applied to many different necklines as long as the seams are being finished in the same way. From this point, you would be adding a skirt or pants and sleeves to complete the garment. In this tutorial, the large floral print will be the main fashion fabric and the small floral print will be the lining. We will start with the back bodice. Lay the back bodice piece of your fashion fabric on your workbench with right side facing up. For garments that feature ties like this one, attach the tie using a 3mm or 1/8 of an inch holding seam. When adding ties, always make sure the sewn seam of the tie is facing downwards. Now position the shirred back panel onto the back bodice with right sides together. Ensure that the top of the shirring aligns with the ledge point of the back bodice and the bottom of the shirring matches the bottom of the bodice. Also align any middle notches using as many pins as needed. Next, sew a holding seam along the edge of the shirring using a 0.3cm or 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once sewn, ensure all the shirring threads are captured in the line of stitching. If they are not, they can be pulled through. Then you can trim back the elastic and any shirring threads that are overhanging. This will give you a neat edge to work in the coming steps. Place the lining back bodice onto the back bodice fashion fabric with right sides together. You'll be sandwiching the back shirring and the tie between the bodice pieces. Begin sewing at the waist with a 1.5cm or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. When you reach the end of the shirring, your seam will be reduced to 0.6cm or 1/4 of an inch. There's no need to adjust your sewing line, simply continue sewing in a straight line. Ensure to backstitch over the tie to reinforce it. And now we have neatly encased the shirring in the lining. Now let's move on to the second side, which follows a similar process to what we did on the first side. Begin by matching the unsewn edge of the shirring with the back bodice fashion fabric. Sew a holding seam with 0.3cm or 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Afterwards, trim back the shirring threads and elastic just like we previously did on the other side. Place the lining on the back bodice with right sides together, matching the seam points. At the machine, sew the seam following the same process we did on the first side, starting with a seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch and transitioning to 0.6cm or 1/4 of an inch as you reach the end of the shirring. To complete the back bodice, we'll be understitching the back neckline to ensure the lining doesn't show from the right side. If you need a more in-depth tutorial on understitching, check the link provided below. Start by opening the back bodice so the fashion fabric and lining are both wrong side up. You only want to understitch from where the shirring ends to the top of the shoulder seam. Press the seam allowance towards the lining. Head to the machine to complete the understitching by sewing the seam allowance to the lining. The stitching should be sewn 0.2cm or 0.1 inch on the lining side of the sewn seam. After sewing, turn the garment right side out and give it a thorough pressing. Repeat this process for the second side of the back bodice. Next, let's work on the front bodice. With wrong sides together, pin the front bodice lining to the front bodice fashion fabric along the neckline. First pin any neckline points, then add extra pins as needed. If your neckline has specific turning points, like our example, marking them out before sewing can be very helpful. Use a 0.6cm or 1/4 of an inch seam allowance to do this. With these marked points, you know precisely where to pivot while sewing. Proceed to sewing the neckline using a 0.6 centimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure to pivot accurately at any marked points. After sewing, snip tiny triangles right up to the stitch line at any neckline points. Be very careful not to cut the stitches. This will assist in achieving a sharp edge once the bodice is turned right side out. Lastly, it's time to trim back the interfacing. You'll want to trim it back to the stitch line on both the lining and fashion fabric sides. To finalize the front bodice, begin by pressing the seam allowance towards the lining. Remember to test your iron's heat when pressing directly onto interfacing or use a pressing cloth. Move on to understitching the neckline. If your neckline has turning points, sew between each of these sections separately. Once the understitching is complete, turn the bodice so the right side is out and give it a thorough pressing to set the lining in place. With both sections sewn, we will move on to joining the shoulder seams. Start by positioning the two bodice sections with linings together as if they are already sewn. First, match the lining shoulder seams with right sides together. Then open up the shoulder so you can continue to the fashion fabric side with right sides together. Align the middle sewn seam 1.5 centimeters down from the raw edge so it will match once sewn. Insert a pin at this point to check that it pierces through the stitch line on both sides. Make sure any ties are pinned out of the way so you won't accidentally sew them. Sew along the shoulder seam with a 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. After sewing, flip your garment right side out to ensure it's sewn correctly. If everything looks good, proceed to trim the shoulder seam down to 0.6 centimeters or 1/4 of an inch. Finally, flip the bodice so it's right side out and give it a thorough press. Finally, we'll move on to sewing the side seams. Again, lay your bodice as if it's finished and sewn. Fold in the fashion fabric, then pin the front bodice lining to the back bodice lining at the side seams with right sides together. Sew with a 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Grab a sleeve press or rolled up piece of linen or cotton and press the seam open. With the front bodice fashion fabric wrong side up, pull the lining up and out of the way. Align the fashion fabric front and back bodice side seams with right sides together. This may seem a little tricky at first, but as long as you match the notches to the front and back, there's not too much that can go awry. Then sew with a 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, again using your sleeve press to press the seam open. A little fitting note, this is a great time to try on the bodice and check the fit. You can adjust the side seams as needed. If it's slightly too small, sewing with a 1 centimeter seam allowance will give you an extra 2 centimeters. Or if it's a little big, sewing with a 2 centimeter seam allowance will reduce the bodice by 2 centimeters. Remember to also use the same seam allowance alterations on the skirt waistline. Finally, to finish, sew holding seams along the raw edges of the armhole and waistline with a 0.3 centimeter or 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And you have completed a beautifully lined bodice, complete with a shirred back for that tailored fit. If you love sewing, we've got something to help you plan out your creations, our awesome and awesomely free PDF sewing planner. Jot down your measurements, hack plans, and supplies for every project and add your fabric swatches and garment sketches. Use one of our 4 croquis models or sketch on the blank planner pages. It also includes a collection planner for organizing swatches and styling ideas for mini wardrobe collections and a 12-month sewing calendar. Get all your measurements sorted with our journal and step-by-step video tutorial, which walks you through how to take each measurement. download your planner for free at madelabel.co/planner so you can get creative and plan out the wardrobe of your dreams.